My daughter texted me at 6:40 in the morning. Dad, small change of plans. You're not coming to the lake house this weekend. Brian's parents are flying in, and it's going to be a full house. I read it twice, standing in my kitchen with the coffee pot still gurgling behind me. By Monday, I had called my accountant, my lawyer, and a man named Gary Petrosian who owed me a favor. By the following Friday, the lake house didn't belong to anyone in my family anymore. My name is Walter Kowalski. I'm 67 years old. I spent 38 years running an HVAC and commercial refrigeration company out of Cleveland, Ohio, the kind of business where you start out crawling through attic crawl spaces in July and end up, if you're lucky and stubborn enough, owning half the walk-in coolers in 3 counties. I built that company from a single truck with my name hand-painted on the door to 11 trucks and 40 employees. I am not a soft man. I did not get soft in retirement either, though my daughter Melissa seemed to have convinced herself otherwise. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled a weekend, a marriage's finances, and one particular man's sense of entitlement in the space of 9 days, do me a favor. Tell me in the comments what state you're watching from, because I'm curious how far this story travels. And if you've ever had a grown child treat your generosity like it was owed to them, hit like, because you already know where this is going. Let me back up, because you need to understand the lake house before you understand anything else. 3 years ago, my wife Carol passed away. Pancreatic cancer. Diagnosed in March. Gone by October. 34 years of marriage ended in 7 months. And I want to tell you, there is no version of losing a wife of that many years that leaves you standing upright the way you were before. Carol was the one who wanted the lake house. Not a mansion. Nothing showy. Just a modest 3-bedroom place on Chippewa Lake, 40 minutes from Cleveland, with a dock and a row of Adirondack chairs facing west so she could watch the sun go down over the water. She used to say that was the only luxury she ever wanted in her whole life. A porch, a lake, and me not working 7 days a week for once. I bought it for her the year before she got sick. We had exactly 1 full summer there together. 1 summer of grilling on the back deck, of her reading paperback mysteries in that chair while I fixed the dock pilings, of our daughter Melissa and her husband Brian driving up on weekends with their kids. It was, without exaggeration, the best summer of my adult life, and I didn't know enough to be grateful for it while it was happening, because none of us ever do. After Carol died, I couldn't bring myself to sell the place. Instead, I did something that in hindsight might have been the first mistake in a long chain of them. I told Melissa and Brian they could use the lake house whenever they wanted. Not rent it. Use it. Free. As if it were their own. I even paid to have the dock rebuilt after a bad winter, put in a new roof, covered the property taxes myself every single year without ever mentioning it, because that's what you do for your only daughter, the one person left who still carried pieces of Carol in her face. I told myself that keeping the lake house alive for Melissa's family was a way of keeping Carol alive too. I did not examine that idea very closely. I wish now that I had. Here is what I did not know for the better part of 2 years. Brian, my son-in-law, had been telling his own parents and, from what I later pieced together, half his golf league, that the lake house was his. Not that his wife's family had a lake house they generously let him use. His, as in purchased and maintained through some vague, never specified success of his own. Brian sells commercial insurance. He is not a bad salesman, and he is not, in the ordinary sense of the word, a bad person. But he is the kind of man who has spent his entire adult life needing to be seen as more successful than he actually is, and somewhere along the way he had rewritten the story of that lake house until he was the hero of it. The text came on a Tuesday. Brian's parents, Carl and Denise, were flying in from Arizona for the first time in 3 years, and Melissa wanted, in her words, a nice, low-key family weekend. Just us. I want to be honest with you. My first reaction wasn't rage. It was something quieter and worse. It was the particular, specific hurt of being erased from a place that existed, physically existed, because of my dead wife's one wish and my own money. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time, long enough for the coffee to go cold in the pot. I want you to sit with me in that kitchen for a minute, because this is the part of the story where most people, myself included on a different day, would have just called their daughter and asked what was going on. I almost did that. My thumb was actually hovering over her name in my phone. But something stopped me, and it wasn't spite. Not yet. It was a feeling I recognized from 4 decades of running a business, The feeling you get right before you realize somebody's been quietly stealing from the register. You don't confront them yet. First, you watch. First, you find out how deep it goes. So instead of calling Melissa, I called my old friend Doris, who lives 2 houses down from the lake property and has known my family since Melissa was in diapers. I asked her, casual as I could manage, whether she'd seen much activity up at the house lately. Doris, bless her, has never once in 60 years been able to resist a piece of gossip, and she told me, without me even having to push, that Brian had been telling people at the Marina bait shop that he and Melissa were thinking about finally winterizing their place, and that his father was coming to see it for the first time since Brian bought it. Bought it. I sat with that word for a long time. I drove up to the lake house that Thursday, 2 days before Carl and Denise were set to arrive. I didn't announce myself. I parked down the road at the public boat launch and walked the tree line the way I used to walk a job site before I'd trust a crew to run it unsupervised, which is to say, quietly and with my eyes open for anything that didn't match what I'd been told. The house looked exactly the way I'd left it in the fall, except for one thing. There was a brand new for sale style sign, one of those custom wooden ones you order off Etsy, mounted by the front door. It read, "The Kowalski Hartley Lake House, Est, 2019. Hartley is Brian's last name. Est. 2019 is the year I bought the place with money I earned crawling through crawl spaces while Brian was still trying to make partner at his second insurance agency. I stood in the trees behind that sign for a long time. I am not ashamed to tell you that my hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. Here's where I want to slow down, because this next part matters more than the sign. I drove home that night, and I did not sleep. I sat in Carol's old reading chair, the one we'd moved up from the house in Cleveland, and I thought about all 40 summers of my marriage, and I thought about the fact that the last, best gift I ever gave my wife had been quietly rebranded by a man who married into it. And I want to tell you honestly, the anger I felt was not really about the sign. The sign was just the moment the anger found a shape. What I was actually grieving was the sense that Carol's memory, the one physical place that still held her, had been absorbed and repackaged into someone else's story, and my own daughter had let it happen, maybe even helped it happen, without ever once picking up the phone to check with me. I called Melissa the next morning and asked, gently, plainly, whether everything was all right with the lake house. She hesitated just long enough for me to know she was choosing her words. She told me Brian's parents had never really understood their financial situation, and Brian had maybe exaggerated a little at some point years ago, and it had just sort of stuck, and it was easier to let it ride than correct it now, especially with his parents coming to visit. She asked me, and I want you to hear this the way I heard it, whether I would mind playing along for the weekend. Not being there, just not correcting the story if it ever came up. She said it would mean a lot to Brian. I told her I understood. I did not tell her what I intended to do next, because at that point, I honestly did not know yet myself. I want to tell you about Gary Petrosian, because Gary is the reason the next 9 days moved as fast as they did. Gary and I go back to 1994. I did the entire HVAC system for his first restaurant for a fraction of what it should have cost, back when we were both young and broke and betting everything on our own 2 hands. Gary went on to become one of the more quietly successful commercial real estate investors in Northeast Ohio, the kind of man who owns things through 6 different LLCs and never once raises his voice in a negotiation because he doesn't have to. I called Gary that Friday morning, the day before Carl and Denise landed in Cleveland, and I asked him one question. How fast can you move on a lake property if the seller already owns it outright and just wants it gone? Gary laughed for a good 5 seconds before he realized I was serious. Here's the part I need you to understand about the lake house, financially. I never put Melissa or Brian's name on that deed. Not out of distrust, at least not originally, but because Carol and I had bought it together, and after she passed, it simply stayed in my name through probate, the way most things do when you don't get around to changing them. Brian had spent years telling people he owned a house he had never once paid a mortgage payment on, a house he wasn't even on the deed of, a house that legally, cleanly, entirely belonged to me, and only me. Melissa knew this. She had simply never bothered to correct her husband's story, because it was more comfortable to let a lie live in the house than to have an uncomfortable conversation at Thanksgiving. I told Gary I wanted an offer within 72 hours. Cash, no contingencies, no inspection period longer than necessary, and I wanted it closed before the end of the month. Gary, being Gary, didn't ask me why. He asked me one thing. You sure about this, Walt? That's Melissa's place, too. In her head, at least. I told him it had never once been Melissa's place. It had been Carol's dream and my money. And somewhere in the last 3 years, it had quietly become a stage prop in another man's story about himself. And I was done paying the property taxes on somebody else's lie. Gary had a buyer lined up by Sunday night. A young couple relocating from Columbus who'd been looking at Chippewa Lake for over a year and had cash sitting in a brokerage account waiting for the right listing. We signed a purchase agreement the following Wednesday. I want to be clear about the timing here, because it matters. Carl and Denise arrived Saturday. The weekend Melissa wanted so badly to protect happened exactly as planned, without me, at a house that was already, unbeknownst to any of them, 5 days into being sold out from under the entire fiction Brian had built. I did not tell Melissa what I was doing. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was strategy, the same instinct that had served me for decades in business. The idea that you don't announce a decision until it's already made, because half-finished decisions get talked out of existing. But if I'm being fully honest with you, and I think at this point in my life I owe myself that honesty, part of it was also that I wanted her to feel, even for a handful of days, a version of the same erasure I'd felt reading that text message at my kitchen table. I'm not proud of that particular motivation. I'm also not going to sit here and pretend it wasn't there. The closing happened on a Thursday, 10 days after the original text. I drove up to the lake house one final time that morning, before the new owners took possession, and I walked through every room by myself. I sat in Carol's chair on the deck one last time and watched the water the way she used to. I did not cry, though I came close. I took 2 things with me before I locked the door for the final time as the legal owner: her chair and a small brass wind chime she'd hung by the back door the first week we owned the place, the one that used to wake her up gently on summer mornings. Everything else, the furniture Brian had picked out to replace some of Carol's original pieces, the custom sign with his name carved into it, I left exactly where it stood, because it wasn't mine to take, and honestly, it wasn't going to be his problem for very much longer either. The new owners could deal with the sign however they liked. Now, here is where the story does something I did not entirely plan for, and I think it's important I tell you the truth of it, rather than make myself sound like some kind of mastermind, because I wasn't. I hadn't accounted for Denise. Brian's mother, it turns out, had spent that entire weekend quietly asking questions. Not suspicious questions, just a mother's ordinary curiosity, the kind that comes from actually paying attention to her son's life instead of just admiring it from a distance. She asked Melissa, at one point over dinner, how the mortgage on the lake house compared to their place back in Cleveland. Melissa, caught completely off guard, said something vague about the property being paid off. Denise, who had apparently handled all the finances in her own household for 40 years and was nobody's fool, pressed a little further, the way mothers do, and Melissa, rattled and unprepared, ended up telling her the truth, that the house belonged to me, that it always had, that Brian had never so much as seen the deed. I did not learn any of this until later, from Melissa herself, in a phone call I will get to. But I want you to sit with the image of that dinner table for a second, because I think it's the emotional center of everything that follows. Brian, sitting there in a lake house he'd spent 3 years claiming as his own, having his own mother quietly, gently dismantle the story in front of everyone, one calm question at a time. Nobody yelled. Melissa told me later that was almost the worst part, how quiet it got. They flew home Sunday. Brian, by all accounts, barely spoke to Melissa for the entire drive back to Cleveland from the airport. On Tuesday, 5 days after the closing, Melissa called me. She did not know yet that the house was sold. She called, I believe, because she needed somebody to be angry at, and I had, without either of us saying it out loud, been quietly nominated for the role for years. She told me Denise had figured out the truth, that Brian was humiliated, that their marriage was, in her words, hanging by a thread over a stupid lake house. And did I have any idea how much damage that one careless comment about property taxes could do to a family? This is the moment I told her. I did not raise my voice. I want you to understand that, because I think it matters. I told her, calmly, the way I used to deliver bad news to a client whose furnace had died in the middle of January, that the lake house had sold 9 days ago, that it was no longer in the family, would never again be in the family, and that the new owners were a lovely young couple from Columbus who I sincerely hoped would enjoy the sunsets as much as her mother once had. The silence on the other end of that call lasted so long I genuinely thought the line had dropped. When Melissa finally spoke again, it wasn't anger. Not at first. It was disbelief. The specific kind that comes from realizing a parent you assumed was predictable, was safely, permanently, on your side, no matter what, has just done something you genuinely did not think them capable of. She asked me how I could do that without even talking to her first. I told her I had talked to her. I told her exactly what she'd asked of me, the week before, over the phone. She had asked me to disappear for the weekend and let her husband's lie stand uncorrected in front of his own parents. I told her I had simply finished the job she'd already started. If the house's story could be rewritten once to make Brian comfortable, I said, I supposed it could be rewritten a second time to make me honest. She cried. I'm not going to pretend that was easy to hear. There is nothing in 38 years of running crews through Ohio winters that prepares you for the sound of your own daughter crying on the phone because of a decision you made. But I want to tell you something I've come to understand slowly, in the weeks since. I did not sell that house to punish Melissa. I sold it because I finally understood that I had spent 3 years trying to keep Carol's memory alive by handing it to people who didn't actually value what it represented, only what it provided. Brian never once asked about Carol's garden along the side of the house, never once mentioned missing her at Thanksgiving. He talked about square footage and lake frontage and what the place would be worth in 10 years. Somewhere in there, without noticing, I'd let my wife's dream become a prop in somebody else's ambitions, and it took a lie about a wooden sign to finally wake me up to it. Brian, for his part, never called me at all. Not once. Not in anger. Not in apology. I found that, in its own way, more revealing than anything Melissa said. A man who spends years quietly telling people he owns something can rarely bring himself to face the person who actually did. 6 weeks after the sale, Melissa called again. Calmer this time. She told me she and Brian were seeing a marriage counselor, which I did not know how to feel about. Honestly, some mix of guilt and relief that I'm still sorting through even now. She told me Denise, of all people, had become an unexpected ally, had told Melissa privately that she'd always found her son's stories a little too polished, a little too convenient, and that maybe it was time everyone in that family started telling the truth about where things actually came from. I used part of the proceeds from the lake house to do something I probably should have done 3 years earlier. I bought a much smaller place, just a one-bedroom cabin really, on a quieter lake 2 hours further north, in my name only, no guest room for anyone to eventually claim as their own legacy. I put Carol's chair on the dock. I hung her wind chime by the door. Some mornings I sit out there with my coffee and I don't think about Brian or the sign or any of it. I just watch the water the way she used to, and for a few minutes at a time, it's enough. Melissa asked me, in that same 6-week call, whether she could come visit the new place sometime, just her, without Brian, without the kids even, just to sit on the dock the way she used to as a little girl at the old house. I told her the door was always open to her. I meant it. This was never about cutting my daughter out of my life. It was about making sure nobody, not a son-in-law, not even my own grief, ever again got to decide what Carol's memory was worth without asking me first. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. Generosity without boundaries doesn't protect the people you love. It just gives someone else room to rewrite the story while you're still standing in it. I gave Melissa and Brian a gift because I loved my daughter, and I was trying to keep my wife close. I forgot, for a while, that a gift you never define, the terms of, eventually stops being a gift and starts being a story other people get to tell about themselves. I won't make that mistake again. Not with the cabin. And honestly, not with much else in the years I've got left. Thank you for sitting with this story from start to finish. If it reminded you of your own family, of your own quiet sacrifices that somebody else eventually took credit for, tell me about it below. And if you've ever had to take back something you gave freely, just to remind everyone, including yourself, of who it actually belonged to, you already know exactly how heavy and how necessary that decision can feel.